Hello, everybody. Thank you for being here. I really appreciate it. My name's Jawanza James Williams. I use he, him pronouns. And I work at Vocal New York, a membership organization. It's a statewide organization committed to building power to end the war on drugs, mass incarceration, homelessness, and HIV and AIDS as an epidemic in New York State. And we do that work through organizing the most directly impacted people and taking their guidance about how we co-govern in our state. And so we organize 4 issue-based unions, and that's the Civil Rights Union, the Positive Leaders Union, and the Homeless Union, and today's special union, the Users Union, which is made up of people who are active and former drug users, and they are the folks that understand the implications of the drug war. They understand what drug users need as people who are former and active drug users, and we are rooted in the idea of harm reduction. So today's conversation is called Towards Abolitionist Futures, Defunding the NYPD and Dismantling the Racist and Classist Drug War. And we thought to have this moment because the whole world is in a moment of unmitigated change. We are seeing the people call for a paradigm shift when we say defund the police and then reinvest in communities. And what I'm concerned about, though, is that we don't want that message to be co-opted by the establishment. We don't want that message to be filled with meanings that have nothing to do with the people that are directly impacted. And in fact, we were, in my office, we were very concerned about the fact that the drug war is a political apparatus, a mechanism that the state, the capital S state, uses as a way to suppress dissent, to abuse people, and to extract wealth from our communities. The drug war has always been explicitly political, and in fact, I was going to do a brief history of the drug war. However, the 3 panelists are so profound and proficient that I don't think it's necessary for me to give folks that kind of education in this moment. You can look those things up later. But we want to make sure that people understand that the drug war is literally the vehicle for the sort of entry point for most police and community interactions. Oh, you were selling drugs. Oh, you were using drugs. We smelled weed. Oh, we saw you purchase a drug. So when that happens, when that moment happens, we already have a world that is filled with stigma when it comes to people who use drugs and people that sell drugs, right? And then the police, the oppressive apparatus of the state, are executing the mandates of an oppressive state, and they're using drugs as justification. We see that with Breonna Taylor, which I'll let folks on the panel talk about, but we see that with many of the people that have been killed by police violence, as drug use and drug possession, et cetera, being used as justification for murder and also justification for the kinds of violence that is commonplace in Black and brown communities, in particular low-income communities, and in particular those people that are active and former drug users. So today's panel is stellar, so I want to shut up really quick. I just want to name that we have Cassandra Federico, the Executive Director of the Drug Policy Alliance, a national organization, and she can introduce herself more. And we have Robert Suarez, who is one of my heroes, and also a global phenomenon when it comes to, radically changing how not only the US, not only New York State, but the world understands drug users. It understands how to craft policy rooted in dignity and humanity and evidence-based treatments, right? And I think that Robert Suarez is definitely, he's a leader of the Users Union at Vocal, and he has been for over 10 years. And he's also an organizer nationally with the Urban Survivors Union. So I'm very excited for him to speak with you all today. And we also finally have Kenyon Farrow, who is also another one of my, all of these people are my heroes, I should just say. But Kenyon Farrow is a longtime activist, organizer, abolitionist in New York State. Been doing work, I know, in New York City at least since the year 2000. And works with thebody.com, or The Body and the Body Pro, as the senior editor, and has a very unique perspective to add here too. Today as a queer person, as a queer Black man. And I also wanted to note that these 3 people in particular are important people to hold this conversation because they understand what harm reduction is, what it means to be a Black person in these racist states, and also how to hold the complexity of the calls for abolition, what that actually means for real people today, and also to be able to keep that within a sort of scope that will get us closer to self-determination, that will get all of us closer to liberation. So I think that this is one of those critical moments where a praxis can happen. So if you don't know about the drug war being racist and classist, if you don't understand how the oppressive states function together, then this is a good place for you to be.
Hey everybody, thank you. Unmuted myself. So just a quick introduction to myself and talk a little bit about the subject tonight. So as Jawanza mentioned, thank you for that introduction. So I'm currently senior editor of a website called thebody.com, which does HIV primarily, news and information, resources, etc. But I have a longer history doing kind of organizing work, a lot of communications and media strategy work for social justice work. And I think I'll just start the conversation tonight kind of talking about how I got to abolition as kind of a grounding point in my own history and political life. So I moved to New York in January 1999. I'm originally from Cleveland, Ohio. And my initial reason for moving to New York, like a lot of folks, was performing arts. I was a trained actor, worked in the theater, moved to New York to pursue more work in the theater. And I got to New York probably less than a month before Amadou Diallo was killed in the Soundview part of the Bronx, as some of you who are old enough to remember, which happened in '99. And which started a whole kind of another wave of police brutality or anti-police brutality or organizing in New York at that time. And, so I remember kind of that happening. I went just kind of to some protests or whatever. At the same time that was happening, I was also connected to some of the folks who started the organization Fierce. Those of you who know Fierce as a queer youth of color community organizing project was just getting off the ground around 99, 2000-ish, while I was still working in theater. And around that same time, around, I would say 9/11, when 9/11 happened and the, kind of all of the kind of war on terror and Patriot Act kind of like increase in surveillance, technology, and the further militarization of the NYPD that happened as a result of that particular moment. I also, at that point, got introduced to Critical Resistance. Those of you who may know Critical Resistance is an organization that's been around since the late 90s, just dedicated to ending the prison industrial complex as we know it. And I say that to say that, a lot of times when we talk about, prison abolition, or people talked about as prison abolitionists, I often try to remind people that, like, I am a prison industrial complex abolitionist in the sense that I think what we're talking about is not just the thinking about a world without prisons or jails, the kind of cages, but I think it's actually a politic that's about thinking about what our world would look like without punitive responses to various kinds of harm, or a states creating the idea of crime, which usually targets the actions of individuals, but never, onto itself. And given the kind of range of atrocities that are committed by people, pushing paper through legislation, that means some people eat and some people don't. Some people have housing, some people who don't, as well as, the kind of policing and, prisons and those sorts of things. So I kind of got involved with Critical Resistance at a time when it was clear to me that prisons were not going to solve our problems, and more policing was not going to solve a range of problems. I took a temp job working for a nonprofit in Spanish Harlem around the same time. And one of the things that really started to politicize me around prisons was seeing so many people that I had worked with, all these like Black and brown folks working in Spanish Harlem, some whom had master's degrees by that point or who had achieved different things. But as I kind of worked there for a while, came to learn that many of them had spent time in prison, and most of them on drug convictions. And once I began for myself to kind of see that people, who would have otherwise gone on to do great things to serve their community, but whose lives were put on hold for various points because of, drug use, drug selling, or whatever, had many things to contribute. And it made me just rethink, kind of what we needed prisons for if, people were able to sort of take care of themselves, otherwise. And so at that point, I got involved in critical resistance and then became actually the first Southern region coordinator after the 2003 conference in New Orleans. They needed somebody to help get the chapters of the organization off the ground in the South, and I spent some time there and before moving back to New York and doing further work with critical resistance and with Queers for Economic Justice and some other organizations. I'll just close tonight to say that kind of in the last decade, my work has been primarily focused on HIV in very particular ways, but my kind of politics around abolition have not left me. And just because I haven't been doing necessarily direct, work around, prisons or policing or those sort of issues, it informs the way I think about all of my activism, right? So for me, the questions are always, no matter what issue I'm working on or what I'm writing about, does this institution create more opportunities for people to be harmed by either interactions with police or interactions with, prisons and jails, or how our even kind of social safety net and programs that are supposed to serve people end up becoming ways in which people get kind of trapped into more, sort of tracks for policing in prison and jails. And so everything from HIV criminalization and doing a lot of work to sort of push the movement around ending use of criminal statutes for people for non-disclosure of HIV status or whatever. I'm always pushing people to think beyond just the particular moment of or the particular kind of HIV crime, but about how we don't use statutes to criminalize people for any disease status. And I think that we're starting to see that, obviously, because of COVID-19, the ways in which, people either not social distancing or et cetera are being used to sort of target people through more, policing in prisons. And so I'll just close my opening remarks by saying that whether you work in, kind of harm reduction or issues that are around prison reform or work directly with people who are directly impacted by prisons, that, having a politic around doing less harm and removing as best as possible as we can in our lifetime, the sort of police and prison industrial complex apparatus from people's lives, that work can be done in a myriad of ways, and always carry that, politic through however you see your organizing, whether it's around, identity-based or around housing or around food access or education or whatever. Prison abolition has something to offer all of us. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much, Kenyon. I think you say it very well, especially in those closing points. We've got to be able to hold the complexities. And one of the things that prompted this conversation is that we need to make sure that people understand what we mean when we say defund the police and invest in communities. And I think, to your point, we sort of prison abolitionists, feminist, Black feminist sort of politic as a sort of guide helps us make conscientious decisions, or decisions that consider the full scope of the problems that we're facing as a society. And that's one of the things that I appreciate about your leadership, and also even our next speaker, who is Robert Suarez. Robert, do you want to come back on camera and speak to the folks?
I would love to. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. I am truly honored to be here, and I want to thank you, Jawanza, for this awesome opportunity. I have never had quite an introduction before. I don't even know. I don't know how to follow up with my own my own presentation behind that introduction. But thank you, sir. Thank you very much for that. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Robert Suarez, and I I have been, am now, and will always be a community leader with Vocal New York, or as I like to think of myself, as an organizational leader, because I do so much work with Vocal New York across the many different unions that Vocal has. And I also sit on the board of directors for the North Carolina Survivors Union, as well as do a great deal of work with the Urban Survivors Union as a national coordinator. I'm also a former board member of Input, which is the international network of people who use drugs, where I actually started getting into much more of the national issues that have to do with people who use drugs, and that's a whole other story. But I am blown away and in awe of how we've come together globally to stand against stand up against the racist ways that the United States has basically caused individuals to not only lose their lives, but lose a lot more. Besides that, we have not only been criminalized, we've been demonized, we've been villainized, we've been stigmatized, and all of that has come at the cost of Black and brown people, people of color, who have not just gone to jail, but have gone to the grave. People are no longer on this planet. The war on drugs has ripped apart families, and just when you think we may have a foothold, an individual like Donald Trump lets us all know that we still have so far to go. I want to talk a little bit about what got me here, because I believe it's important, and it's something that I always want to remember, and I always want individuals to understand about me. My mother was an intravenous drug user, and when she was using, she was carrying me. My mother was an individual who cared greatly about not just me, but all of her children. There's 3 of us, and she was an individual who popped up at the weirdest times. So, someone who was a user, and at a young age, I understand what that meant. And being raised by my grandmother, I would see my mother standing in the audience, screaming and going crazy, "That's my child," at my graduations. And for a young Black man being raised by his grandmother, to know that his mother was an intravenous drug user, seeing that woman doing everything she could to make sure that she was in some way visible, in some way in attendance, in some way a part of my life, meant a lot. It meant a lot to me. And I carry so many of those moments with me throughout my life. And a lot of the old tapes that she told me, things that I was taught by her, I still play today. It was not so long ago that I found myself under bridges and under highways as an active user, sleeping in the back of parks. And I had attended a meeting that was being held by Vocal New York, and the individual who was actually facilitating this meeting is on this call as an attendee, and his name is Fred Wright. And I will never forget the day that I gave Fred Wright my phone number. That was the day that literally changed my life, because Fred Wright was relentless in doing what he does as an organizer. And that was making sure that he calls me, and no matter how many times I said no, I wasn't interested, he continued to call, and he continued to make me aware, or to let me know about the many different campaigns that Google was having. And he continued to invite me to each and every one of them, until one day I finally said yes. And the day that I attended the campaign with Vocal was the day that my foot was set upon the path that I've been on ever since. So I owe a lot to Vocal New York. And and the teachings that teachings that I've gotten from Vocal when it comes to understanding what this thing that we are all in, what this thing is. And I wish in so many ways that my eyes weren't open to so much of this, because having an understanding of what's going on in America and across the planet today can be very disheartening. And people whose eyes are closed, people who are not awake, who don't have an understanding of the true horror, the true ugliness of where we are today, it may be best that those individuals remain asleep. One of the things that I try to do as not just an organizer, but as an activist, is I try to wake people up. And I try to give them an understanding of what this war on drugs actually is. The genocide that's been played, the genocide that we as a people have gone through for more than 200 years is an extermination. It's an extermination of a people, and there are many people who just don't understand that. And I've tried my best to break it down to individuals as best I could, but unless you are a part of organizations like Vocal or even the Drug Policy Alliance, where you're actually doing that work and you have an opportunity to see things for what they actually are, you won't understand what it's really hard to get your head wrapped around the horror. And that's the only word that I can come up with. It is a horror that we are all faced with when we think about the war on drugs. And I, for one, at this moment in time, find myself going through many different feelings of fear, anger, confusion. And I've been asked many times, so Robert, what do you think we should do at this moment in time? And I have to be honest. This is a moment in time that I don't think any of us have ever, none of us have ever been here. We are all in uncharted waters. And it's important that we literally work towards understanding this moment, unpacking this moment, and then mobilizing around this moment. And the scariest thing that I can think of is having to deal with another 4 years of the most racist individual on the planet holding a seat of power. And that to me is truly horrifying. I'm going to end there because I know that there are a lot of questions I know that Cassandra are probably fighting at the bit. So once again, I want to thank you, Jawanza, and I hope that we can all work towards a better understanding of where we are at this moment in time. Thank you.
Wow. Robert, you've said a lot there. You said a mouthful. So Robert, you remind us of the complexities of this situation, of like how all of these issues are intersected, that we don't live single issue lives, and that I want to remind the folks that are on the call that remember the drug war, and as my colleague Jasmine Budilla and I often have trained folks across the country now, the drug war has always been a political apparatus of oppression, of crushing dissent. It literally functions specifically to do that. And it's been used in sort of misguided ways to sort of bring health and equity for people, when the reality is that it does the exact opposite. And I think you're a perfect example of that, but also you, Robert, are the perfect example of what it means to see people that use drugs fully as human beings, and that we understand that the circumstances of anybody's lives has everything to do with everything around them and the systems, the ideologies, our cultures, our society. And all of it matters. And for Fred Wright, who used to be the Users Union organizer at Vocal, which that role is now held by Biz, understood that we have to organize the most directly impacted people, because they're the people that really understand what's at stake. And it doesn't mean that you have all the answers. It doesn't mean that a person that is directly impacted is always right. But what it does mean is that these folks understand like the gravity of the issue. And whenever people understand that they have and can build power to respond, you can't stop them. And you know, for Vocal New York, I should say that the Users Union, like all of our unions, ultimately it not only guides us as an institution on which way to go, but it keeps us grounded in people's real life experiences. The union structure creates a democratized sort of decision-making process that keeps us sort of like focused towards what people actually care about, what people actually need. And the way I best say it, I can articulate it, is that they are our moral compass, right? And I think people like Robert, like the reason why I think you're so successful in this work is because every day the world tried to kill you, you survived. And here you are. And who knows how many lives you've saved. It reminds me of the time that we went to the Filipino consulate to protest the president of the Philippines, Duterte, because of this insanely violent war on drugs happening there. And of course, Trump, who you named, is best friends with this guy. But that's you can go there if you want to go there. But I do want to add that it's important that we build institutions outside of the government that can hold them to account. And also it's important for organizations that are organizing, power building organizations, to recognize what our place is in the movements to transform the world, and also to recognize who we need in our corner supporting us. So that's how I want to bring up our next speaker, because the Drug Policy Alliance functions in this very powerful way to help us, substantiate oftentimes what we already know to be true from experiential data. Our membership holds an authoritative understanding of these issues from their own experience. But sometimes we need data. Sometimes we need those kind of bigger organizations that can produce the kinds of documents, et cetera, to help illustrate our point through metrics. And so I want to bring up one of the most phenomenal leaders in the country, or probably the whole world, and that's Cassandra Frederique.
Thank you, Jawanza. I just want to again echo the brilliance that Robert shared with us. There are so many reasons why there are so many policy decisions and structures why none of the Black people on this screen should be here, right? But especially Robert. So it is an honor and a great gift for us to be working and fighting alongside you. So I want to start out with pulling some of the threads together. You know, part of the conversation that I've had, so Cassandra Frederique, I'm the incoming executive director. I don't start that job until September. But Drug Policy Alliance is a national organization. It works on ending the criminalization associated with drugs. We are one of the preeminent organizations that is pushing the conversation on drugs. We are almost 20 years old. And I think it's important because what's super exciting about this moment is how much Black people have pushed to the surface to get a platform and to push a politic. And Kenyon is one of my guiding stars on these issues, because Kenyon's work in New York City, even from the work that we've done with Fierce, but also Queers for Economic Justice, have provided the space for a politic and having conversation. Also the extremely strategic and important work that HIV activists that are Black have done for a long time, as well as reproductive justice activists have done for a long time, have really pushed the radicalization of organizations like Drug Policy Alliance, because I think our history has always been innovative. We've always said cutting edge things, but it wasn't always rooted in the experience. It wasn't always rooted in a politic. Sometimes it could have felt like it was a theoretical exercise of like, wouldn't it be nice? But there have been people that have worked here. We've had conversations about autonomy and civil liberties, which are important to Black people, especially as a Black woman, but have not always been rooted in our experience. And as we've talked about them, have not lent itself to the history of the people that we're saying should have rights. Right? And so before we can even get to a place where Robert and folks in the UU can have a conversation about their right to use drugs, we actually need to start, the prerequisite is the fact that Robert has the right to live, that Robert has the right to eat, he has the right to have a house, he has a right to health care, that he has a right to his own body. And I think that that's something that creates multiple different conversations because people are coming to it in different places. And so as we build a radical politic around drug policy, an intentional radical politic, one that drives the conversation as opposed to the side meeting during drug policy conversations, but one that drives it as a movement, it's important for us to be clear about where we fit in the current inflection of progress. So the conversation that I've had with vocal organizers, and that I was, the first time I've had this conversation in large groups is actually with the Urban Survivors Union. I think last week was having the conversation that there is this moment where we are talking about the death of Black folks that is still, that is righteous, in that everyone's like, this is wrong. This is absolutely wrong. We shouldn't do this. And the archetype of this conversation, the things that we see in the media, divorce it from the way that the drug war created the circumstances for these people to be killed. Right? So Breonna Taylor gets killed in her house because there's a no-knock raid because they thought that home was occupied by someone who sold drugs. George Floyd is killed, and while he is being killed, the officers around them are having conversation about why people shouldn't use drugs, and that he's not dying because they have the knee on his neck, but because he's overdosing from crack. Rashad Brooks is allegedly intoxicated, who fell asleep, right? And so the officer, because of his intoxication, is called to the scene and refuses to listen to Rashad as he's telling him, I can walk home, because he is intoxicated, because there's the allegation that he was intoxicated, right? And so in each story, as folks are flooding the streets righteously, it is right that people are flooding the streets. There is a divorcing of the way that the drug war creates the circumstances, or not creates, exacerbates the circumstances for these Black people to be killed. And it is our job as a movement to contextualize it, because Black people don't just die from law enforcement because that's the way it is. It is a set of decisions and policies and circumstances that are created for those instances to occur. And our job is to dismantle those policies, those structures, those circumstances, so that that circumstance is not a given. And the thing that really gets me is that I'm struggling in this moment, because as we have a conversation about how all these people were, how it was an injustice that all these people were killed, I want to be very clear. If Breonna Taylor was a drug dealer, she should not have been killed in her home, period. There is no excuse. If you are involved with drugs or not, either through use or through selling, we should not have no-knock raids. That is a ridiculous, dangerous, fatalistic use of our state resources in the name of safety. If Rashad Brooks was high on all the drugs, not just alcohol, right? Because alcohol, there's an interesting relationship between alcohol as drug use, right? Where people are like, oh, you know, DUI. We've all driven drunk before. You know, we understand falling asleep when you're at the line for the Wendy's. But if he was actually high on heroin, if he was actually high on crack, if he was high on other illicit substances that our society has not created, would we have gone up for him? And that is a fundamental question that our movement needs to push. Because innocence, right? The framework of innocence, the framework of doing no wrong, is an inadequate frame for us to push up the elevation of state-sanctioned violence against Black people. That even though drugs played a role in some way through stigma or through allegation or through use, that those do not create the circumstances for someone to be killed, and that our movement needs to say so. So much of the story around Breonna, if people have even heard about it, right, is like, and there weren't even drugs there. They caught the guy a long time ago. And that's true. But it is also the fact that even if Breonna was a drug dealer, that she did not deserve to die in her home. And that those are the conversations that our movement needs to push forward. Because its abolition is not only deserving of innocent people, it is deserving of everybody. And that no one actually deserves the drug war. No one deserves it, right? That we're not creating a hierarchy of who deserves to be enforced upon. And that when Drug Policy Alliance says no more drug war, we mean exactly that. Not just a little bit drug war, not drug war for these people, no more, right? And so how do we bring this praxis? How do we interrogate the ways that the drug war's policing is interrupting our lives and also shaping our thinking about who we deserve to pull up for? And this is crucial to understand that when we have conversations about the drug war, when we have conversations about harm reduction, that harm reduction is not an excuse to negotiate with the state. It is not an excuse. This idea that, oh, we have to figure out, like, you know, damn big is an idol in our world, and his words of any positive change are an emblem, right? But we cannot let the tagline of any positive change distract us, destabilize the politic of harm reduction. Because harm reduction was not created for the state to feel better. Harm reduction was about us creating the agency for our communities, about us talking about the structural inequities that created the circumstances for our suffering, right? And that our politic, that naloxone is not actually harm reduction, right? That methadone and buprenorphine are medications and are not essentially harm reduction in that capital way. That harm reduction is figuring out, how do we remove the state from interrupting our lives? How do we reduce the harms of the conditions associated with being a person who uses drugs, a person who sells drugs? But more importantly, for me, harm reduction as a politic and as a ministry is, how do I reduce the harms associated with the conditions of me being Black? How do I reduce the harms associated with me being queer? How do I reduce the harms of me being trans? How do I reduce the harms of me being a woman? Like, all these things are what harm reduction is supposed to do, and our actions that we call under harm reduction should serve that larger goal. And so what are we negotiating, and what are the concessions that we have made as a movement to be a part of the infrastructure and of the state? What does it mean that people who do research are driving the conversation or pushing forward what is viable or useful for our movement? Because I want to be very clear There are people in this country that still don't think syringes are worth our time, that syringe exchanges are worth our time, that it doesn't poll well. And that, you know, this moment when we were in the beginnings of the overdose crisis and we were having conversations about we need to get naloxone in the hands of first responders, that first responders were people who use drugs, not law enforcement. And now we're in this moment where law enforcement is more likely to have access to naloxone than people who use drugs. And that we have missed the fact that policing is a verb, right? It's not one institution, that multiple things are policing us in our movement space, and that abolition and abolitionist practice is dismantling and unrooting the role that policing is playing. And not just policing from service providers, but the policing that happens to people that use drugs when they engage with our organizations, right? And so, like, how do we change the mindset of the cops that are in our minds as we move through our movement space? And before it's like, how do we break the idea of innocence in the conversation of the movement for Black lives, right? And really push forward that people who use drugs, that Black people that use drugs need to be setting the agenda as well. Because Black drug users have a particular experience when it comes to public space, and public space is what is being criminalized over and over again. Black drug users are on the front lines of the battle over public space. And then the conversation also shifts in when we're talking about self-determination and recognizes that even as we have conversations about Black drug users, we also need to have conversations about Black people who struggle with mental illness, right? And recognizing that those populations are connected to each other, and that we recognize that where we have moved with people who use drugs, that has not happened for people struggling with mental illness, and that they are actually further behind. So how can people who use drugs who also have mental illness really build the capacity in our movement to talk about those other nuances? And the thing that I would say about this righteous moment of protest is recognizing that we have to abolish the Drug Enforcement Agency. The DEA needs to be abolished, right? Just like the rest of the drug war, but I want to say specifically about the DEA. And why I say that is the DEA has been abysmal from the beginning, but in this moment, all the technologies that they use to surveil people who are involved with drugs, either using or selling, they are using on protesters right now. The federal government has increased their jurisdiction to do exactly what Jawanza just said, which is to crush dissent. And that the drug war apparatus is one of the preeminent structures to do that. And so when we cannot have a conversation about ending the drug war if we're not having a conversation about the full tentacles of the drug war, and understanding that a Black radical politic has to push us, because Black drug users are literally on the front lines of fighting multiple areas of criminalization, and that even if our people aren't there yet, we need to do the organizing work to make them understand that they are already in the fight, and that is our job as organizers. That is the work that we need to be supporting user unions to do, in understanding the way that we all have to get there together.
Well, okay, well, of course, Cassandra said a lot. So now I want to move us into a conversation piece. And, you know, Cassandra, what you reminded me of, of many things, of course, but it's just of the sort of ways that we've used, the police state to help us advance our harm reduction causes, as you named. And I think that the primary one, I'm sure it popped in everybody's mind, if you know about drug user health in New York State, you're thinking about the LEAD programs, law enforcement assisted diversion. Anytime I think that we pair the police or expand the scope of policing, we set ourselves up for failure. And so I'm wondering, Kenyon, if there's other reflections that you've had from what Cassandra and what Robert have shared and connected to what you've shared.
Thank you. Yeah, I thought a lot about in hearing Robert and Cassandra's remarks about one, the question of innocence and how much, so much of, kind of so-called reform work relies on notions of innocence. Was the person, drunk or using drugs? Did they have no criminal background prior to, arrest or whatever the engagement with the, police or prison system, is or whatever? And yeah, and I totally agree that we have to push, far beyond those kinds of bounds around who's worth, what lives are worth saving in our community, right? And also, I was having a thought too, Cassandra's presentation about, the questions that often come up around how, like, which sort of lives, even within the Black community, we, kind of mobilize and respond to. And so I don't need to say more about a lot of, kind of Black women and Black trans activists that have, really talked in great detail about the ways in which, deaths, particularly of, again, trans women, of Black cisgender women or whatever, at the hands of cops gets, kind of some recognition, but not often the cases that, we see the things that have happened around George Floyd's case happen with that level of engagement and intensity and kind of relentless kind of response. But one, and I think all of those things are valid. I think one of the things that I also think about too is, I think one of the things that we have to also think about is so much of how we even think about what a kind of response to the, prison and policing is in the framework of like engagement with the police, as opposed to like the and also the ways in which like that creates a certain kind of, premature death for Black people. But I often also push folks to think about like there are so many of us who die in other ways that the state is just as responsible for, even when it's not at the hand of a police revolver, right? Or a knee or whatever in that case. And so to me, I think that as we think about, abolition, I often think about too, what does it mean for us as folks who are organizing, who like actively try to organize to resist these systems, how we can begin to kind of foster a different kind of response around other forms of state violence that I think will then meet the whether the gender or sexual orientation or some of the other questions around, and sometimes the innocence questions around who becomes a worthy person to respond to, right? So I often, use the example of a few years ago in Baltimore, Black woman was basically put out of a hospital in Baltimore City in the middle of the night in the wintertime, in nothing but a hospital robe, right, open in the back, and was sitting in a bus stop when man who was also on his way home happened to see her. And it made some local press in Baltimore and some of us who pay attention to things like that. And as it turned out she had some mental health issues, and the hospital just didn't want to deal with her and whatever her medical issues were. And so they just put her out on the street, right? And to me, that is just as violent as a lot of the kinds of things that we normally respond to, right? Whether when there's police involved, like. And so for me, I think that like if we really want to think about expanding the bodies that we mobilize around, within Black communities when there's death, I think we also have to expand the kinds of ways in which premature death shows up at the hands of the state for Black people, that I think we'll get to some of that. This is one of the things I'm thinking about in this conversation.
No, I really appreciate that, Kenyon, because it makes me just think about the ways in which the media and the state have sort of worked in tandem to create this sort of mythology, which leads to the hierarchy that Cassandra named. And we see that from the 80s and the 90s, and we see that today, which I think is why the police have sort of become a part of the solution to overdose across the United States with the LEAD programs, et cetera. I understand the intention of the LEAD programs, and I understand their viability in terms of keeping people alive or out of prisons. But it doesn't help us move forward. It doesn't help us understand the world from the kind of framework of abolition that we actually need. Because if we're always sort of creating our plans based on the sort of oppressor's framework, then we will never actually imagine or think is possible the world that we actually deserve. So I want to bring the next this point to Robert, and and just about like what ways do you think, Robert, that the sort of whitewashing of the overdose crisis across the United States sort of has impacted folks who are active drug users or people that are even organized politically around addressing the drug war, or anything that comes to mind when it comes to that? You need to unmute.
Yeah, whitewashing. Wow. So I think my feelings on this, to begin with, is that politics should have never been a part of the drug war, right? And we need to find a way to remove politics. We need to find a way to take politics out of this, because it's one of the vehicles that continues to drive the drug war. It's unfortunate, but people who use drugs are looked at in many ways as less than. And let me try to explain what I mean by that. Whenever I'm speaking on panels or traveling and speaking at different engagements, I try to make a comparison of the haves and the have-nots. You all right? That's my dog. Terrible. So the haves are the individuals who are in their condos, in their townhomes, in their $500,000 homes. You never see these individuals who use. The only people that you see who are users are the individuals who don't have, the individuals who are homeless, the individuals who suffer from those severe mental illnesses, right? And these are the individuals that are sort of targeted in many ways. There is a community of individuals who need just as much as the individuals who don't have. When it comes to making sure that they are in many ways understood that they deserve. Look, and I don't want to go. I'm doing everything I can to remain calm, but we are at a time where life is just being taken away and just being lost. People who use drugs are amongst the most talented, gifted, and blessed individuals on the planet, man. And when someone like when any famous actor, any famous musician, when they lose their life to an overdose, it's thought of as tragic. But when one of us loses our lives to an overdose, it's not thought of at all. And all life matters when it comes to this thing that they call this war on drugs. This war on drugs that is the longest running war in U.S. history. This war on drugs that has ripped apart communities, ripped apart families. This war on drugs that has taken the lives of individuals. This war on drugs that should never have existed. I reversed an overdose 2 days ago, right on the side of my building. And this was a young woman who had been sleeping on the sidewalk for a number of days, and people would walk past her, and they wouldn't pay any attention to her. She's just another drug addict. Until this one day, she was laying in the middle of the sidewalk, and there was just a crowd gathered around her. And no one at that time, at that moment, had bothered to even dial 911. When I walked up and I noticed, I recognized her, and being someone who does carry naloxone, after administering naloxone, and after after having had to give her mouth to mouth to breathe for a time, I recognized at that moment that that was a life that would have been lost, and no one would have cared. No one would have cared. But if it was someone that was recognized in the community, someone that people thought of as a pillar of the community, someone who was thought of as someone in the community with stature, there would have been a cry, an outpour of anger, right? And a lot of that is directed in the wrong way. So this thing is whitewashed in so many different ways. I can't even begin to explain it. You know, I just know that we are a community of people who have been far too long forgotten, far too long left out of the conversation. And this is one conversation that we will not be left out of. This is one conversation that we will stand. This is one conversation that you will hear our voices across the country when it comes to people who use drugs.
You know, Robert, I really appreciate that. I think you're also just talking about just sort of, you know, I often try to help people understand the drug war and its sort of political realities. You know, Robert mentioned, you know, we need to move politics out of the drug war. And what I think Robert meant to say, or what Robert means, is that we cannot have people trying to address chaotic drug use, mental health complexities, or drug use at all with politics, because when we put politics into it, we create the conditions for exploitation. And you know, I'm always thinking about the fact that in order for capitalism, our economic and also cultural system to function, you must have people that are expendable. You must have people that whose labor is not as valuable, whose ideas is not as valuable, whose culture is not as valuable. Because if everybody is egalitarian, then you can't have a system that exploits people. So I'm wondering, Cassandra, if you could just name for some of us some of the ways to which the drug war literally functions as a sort of vehicle of maintaining capitalism and just sort of helping people understand what we mean when we talk about these things in tandem. Because again, we can't talk about them separately because they're all influencing one another, including white supremacy.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the biggest things around the drug war is its proxy for racial capitalism, right? And like figuring out the way that it navigates the way that people are able to access anything, and the way that even like let's take for example, if someone has chaotic drug use, wants to move into something else, and wants to get access to treatment. That whole experience is based on a trading of goods. And honestly, the goods is health, right? Like the goods is healthcare. And we have commercialized it, monetized it so deeply that you can't even get access to it unless you are a part of a particular class. And the way that the overdose crisis has played out, and the fact that we've marshaled the resources and the attention, is based on who was dying. Upper middle class white people were dying, and we think that those lives are not expendable, and so therefore we must pay and shift life and movement and structures in order to address it, because those are the people that we want to have lead the country and the nation and the world and the global economies, and therefore we can't navigate that in a particular, we can't leave that to be as it is. But one of the points that I wanted to make, going back to what Kenyon was saying about pushing us to see not just the drug war as a factor in the premature death of Black people, but that recognizing that multiple systems, honestly, all the systems serve as an indicator for the premature death of Black people, is that harm reduction is the building. So oftentimes Miriam Kaba will say like, abolition is not just about the tearing down of things, but it's also about the building of things. And it's amazing because harm reduction does that. Harm reduction is about building the structures in our communities based on cooperation, around mutual aid, around collectivism. It's recognizing that the state is unable to address our needs, and therefore we have to create alternative structures to build the kinds of communities that we want for ourselves. And so oftentimes when people are struggling as to whether or not they are operating from an abolitionist praxis, I challenge harm reductionists to recognize that we are already creating the alternative structures. Now, are they as alternative as they can be? Are they, in bed with the state? I see a Q&A here talking about SSPs that have stood up to the state to say, we don't want to engage with y'all anymore. And then they promptly cut the funding, right? And to me, I struggle with that because I also know that SSP needs the resources to serve my people, right? And it's not that I don't want, it's not that I don't, not that I'm like, it's righteous for you to dissolve your relationship with the state. What it means to me is that as you're taking, syringe exchange programs, as you're taking those resources from the state, how are you actively organizing to build the resources so that you don't have to rely on the state to give that? Right? Like we can do both at the same time. And it's actually imperative for us to do both at the same time because we have to build the alternatives now. Harm reduction is about meeting the needs right now but pushing forward so that we can do other things. We should be working towards building our futures, right? And so I think about the people in British Columbia where they're doing the vending machines for safe supply because of COVID. Right? And those are the alternatives. Those are the kinds of things where we're trying to figure out how do we move forward. And so to me, I think our movement, yes, we have to talk about the abolition of the drug war, abolishing the DA, abolishing all the forms of policing around drugs. But if not more, we have to rest on our laurels of building the alternatives of the kinds of societies and the kinds of people we want to be affirmed and loving and thriving for society, because we are one of the only movements that does alternatives at the same time as we do we build alternatives while we turn up on the state. We do them at the same time. And drug policy and harm reduction is one of the only fields that actively gets to do that. Like, we're like, sure, you don't want to give people syringes, you don't want to do safer consumption spaces, we're going to do them underground. And we're going to do them underground, and then we're going to figure out how to win at the state. But we're not waiting for the state to pass the bill for us to do the alternatives. And I think it's like recognizing that we're already operating from an alternative praxis in building the community, and that we have to say that shit with our whole chest. Like, puff out our feathers and really lead the conversation as to how we build out alternatives.
Perfect. Love it. I love all of it. I mean, honestly, sorry, go ahead, Robert.
Yeah, one of the things that seems to be an issue is, and I had this conversation with an individual the other day, and you're right, you're so spot on, Cassandra, but it just dawns on me that we are so siloed within our organizations, right? That we're not necessarily heard about that one issue that sort of brings this whole thing together. And until we come together as a sort of drug user organization, this one organization that's fighting for these one or two issues, or that those one or two low-hanging fruits that brings that whole tree to us, we're not going to get what we need done. So we need to work towards not only continuing to do our work, our prospective work, and our prospective states or cities, but we also need to come together and stop being so siloed in our work as well.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, Robert, because like to your point, like we need, again, like I really appreciate Dr. Angela Davis and Dr. Cornell West, because these folks have sort of offered me up sort of sort of apparatus of like politic to be able to understand how to maintain my politic across the board. And like once you have those lenses and you are in community with the people that are affected by these issues, you kind of, you're a lot more likely to get it right because you're not going to assume things, you're going to ask the right questions. But I really know we're running low on time. So I do want to make sure that we create space for the Q&A. So I want to bring up Vocal New York's current Users Union organizer, Elizabeth Berthy, who goes by Biz, to do some Q&A stuff. Biz, also tell us a bit about yourself, just so people know who you are.
Hey everyone, thank you to all the panelists that just spoke. Like Jawanza said, I'm Biz, I'm the drug policy organizer at Vocal New York, and I started working as the drug policy organizer in October after spending a couple years working in direct services in Philadelphia, specifically in Kensington, where the overdose crisis is quite intense. And I decided, I reached sort of like my capacity for tolerating like all of the injustices that we've just named, realizing that like sort of what everyone has already named of like the drug war, not just existing within police departments and law enforcement, but also even in harm reduction organizations and harm reduction spaces. And that really pushed me to realize that I needed to step out of that space and start building power with people who are directly impacted. And I can't think of a better place than Vocal. And I'm very grateful that I get to learn from folks like Robert every day. Okay, so this is a question for the panelists first, because it's 7:15. So how do folks feel about taking like 2 to 3 more questions from people? Okay with that? All right. I am, just because I just spoke about Philly, someone in the chat, I can't see it now, but talked about safe injection sites and what we can be doing to sort of push that agenda further. They were wondering why efforts to institute safe injection sites in New York City seem to be stalled, and if that is the result of pushback on a policy level or like an on the ground sort of public understanding of harm reduction level.
Okay. Okay, Cassandra, I'll take this one. So, in my opinion, it's a little bit of both. Well, no, actually, no. I believe that we have the support on the ground, right, for safe injection facilities, and that pushback is coming from Cuomo, who the rest of the country sees as this awesome, awesome leader, who actually is an individual who plays, in many ways, both sides of the fence. So we have gone to our governor and to our leaders and to our legislative leaders with the issues, with the sort of how to fix the issue, with a lot of the science behind us to get that done. And we've received nothing but a wall in front of us. Unless individuals like Cuomo wants it, it's just not going to happen. And once again, if we move in a true movement towards obtaining this, it will happen. But if we remain siloed and trying to get it done, it won't happen. That's the best way I can explain it.
I think I would just add to what Robert said, is that we need to do more political education with our family members. And we haven't built enough power to sustain the momentum that we once built, right? And so elected officials played the game of placating us, right? And saying, okay, we can do it. And got the health department, the mayor saying, okay, we ran a great campaign. And then it got stalled because it got pushed to the governor. And one of the things that we're seeing all over the place is, even in the COVID-19, is like, while everyone's pushing for progressive prosecutors, and that's good, we realize that the people that let people out of jails and prisons are governors and mayors, right? And how do we build the political power and infrastructure to actually pressure them to act? And those would be the same political power structures that we need for the governor to act in this case. And then the other thing is, like, oftentimes people are like, well, why can't you just, pitch a tent and do it like other places? And the fact of the matter is that we got way more Black people than those other places. And so any kind of insurrection like that in a place like New York City just has a higher level of risk and danger. And we haven't built, in my opinion, we haven't built the infrastructure of support that would protect those Black and Latino members that would push that.
Thank you, both of you. The next question, just to sort of tie things together, is from another one of Vocal UU's leaders, Will Robertson. He asked, because the union has been discussing this a lot, there is a deep need right now for political education, because even if the police are defunded $1 billion, right? Like, at the end of the day, it will be community members that are still calling the police on each other, exactly for the reasons that Robert illustrated with the woman who overdosed outside of his building, which doesn't even get into how calling 911 also involves law enforcement when it shouldn't. But Will is asking, I think, if any of you have specific ways in mind to educate the public so that they can, as he says it, truly understand that this is a war on people, not a war on drugs.
Yeah, I think, Vocal New York, about 2 years ago, it was 2 or 3 years ago, we did a statewide, a New York State tour. And I think we toured something like nine cities in 7 days. And it was our Safe Shape pop-up tour that we did in conjunction with the Drug Policy Alliance. And I think something like that needs to be done again. As we have this momentum, we constantly need to come up with ways to keep the momentum, and find ways to continue to educate the public. That Safe Shape tour was a powerful example of how people sort of started to buy into what a safe consumption space would look like. And yeah, I think something like that needs to be done again.
I would add to that real quick. I think in one way we've actually done a good job, I think, of kind of educating the public around the I hate to say failure of the drug war, because it actually did what it was supposed to do. So I don't want to say failure, but of the damage of the drug war and how useless it was in terms of actually, the things that people sort of thought that they wanted, reduction in drug use, whatever the things are. So I think generally speaking, across the country and certainly in Black communities, people understand that. What we haven't done as good a job at is the what next, because that's where we're meeting the opposition. We're meeting the opposition when we start talking about, safe consumption sites in communities. We're losing, the opposition when we talk about, the decriminalizing sex work and what it means in terms of how people will, participate right in that as a job or as a consumer or what have you. So we're losing on the what after the critique, right? And in fact, a lot of our, kind of sometimes folks in communities, when it comes down, people will talk about the, prison industrial complex and, the 13th Amendment, and all the things. But when you say we want a safe consumption site, at the corner of, Nostrand and Fulton or whatever, or even a shelter for people who are homeless, because living in Bed-Stuy, I was, in community board meetings about 10 years ago when there were Black folks in Bed-Stuy who did not want a shelter in the neighborhood. You know what I mean? Like, so I think that's where we're losing. And I think like it's where we have to figure out how to kind of shift the dynamics where people think about, where people begin to really think about what it means to participate in the community more broadly, and not about like my own kind of a certain kind of privatization of how we think about space and community. That's where we're losing. And that also means some of our elected officials. I mean, I think, frankly, the thing that has pissed me off almost as much as the police in the last couple of weeks is seeing people like Jim Clyburn from South Carolina get on TV and say, well, they don't really mean defund the police, and kind of make all these excuses on behalf of the Democratic Party to kind of get around some of the demands that we have, right, and that we've had for a very long time. And that is a result of, some Black people who get elected to those positions and have for some years are also very conservative on those kinds of issues, even if they're in the Democratic Party. So I think it's like, that's the shift that for me we have to make, is less about people agreeing that the drug war was bad. I think most people agree with that at this point, which is a success. I mean, I think we should own that as a win. The next level of the work is how we talk about what's next, and how people can see, whether it's people who use drugs, people who are homeless, people who are sex workers, trans women, whatever the marginalized folks are, as members of a community that deserve to have their needs met in community, right, and not someplace else.
Absolutely, thank you. Just moving on to another question, I might combine some of these, but one individual asked about syringe exchange programs, how, as we've all sort of mentioned individually, how policing as a verb also exists even within harm reduction spaces. So this individual is wondering how to move forward as essential healthcare, or how essential healthcare organizations can move forward without sort of compromising true harm reduction values and severing ties with the state, capital S.
This is a really hard question. I think we need to have a conversation about where we ultimately want to end up, right? I think we have to figure out where we want to end up. And I also think, like, what are the risks and community impacts to dissolving the relationship with the state? And how do we build contingency plans to mitigate those risks? And how do we create the opportunity and the resources for us to build collective responsibility around the health of our community members, right? And so, like, syringe exchanges exist currently as an alternative, but in our future, is it that we want people to only get syringes by going to a particular place? Or is it that we just want them in Duane Reade's where people can just go get them, right? So it's really about, like, this is what we have in front of us, but is this ultimately where we want to end up? And, like, how do we create healthcare for all kinds of people in a way that is not based on the dregs of capitalism and institutionalization? And so it doesn't give you an answer for the immediate, but I think it's like, how do we figure out what is the contingency plan to get to where we ultimately want to go? And I don't know, Kenyon, because you might have other ideas, so I'm just gonna call on you.
I don't. I think so. I appreciate your response, but I wouldn't add to it. And yeah, we can move on to the next one.
Okay, and maybe this is perhaps the last question, and I'm sure that Jasmine, and again, Jasmine is the drug policy coordinator at Vocal New York, could also speak to this, but someone would like to understand more about what LEAD is exactly, And it seems like they are wondering about our perspective on it because we are not the police.
I'm sorry, what was the question?
The question is, what is LEAD? I think someone doesn't understand what the LEAD program is in New York City.
I defer to Cassandra.
I knew you were going to do that, Robert. So LEAD is, so it's important, LEAD is called Law Enforcement Assisted Diversion. And it is essentially a diversion program where law enforcement, in their contacts with people in the street, instead of taking people to jail or custody, they have an agreement with the district attorney in their locality to make the choice on whether or not someone is diverted based on a set of conditions, right? So is it petty crime? Is it petty larceny? Is it low-level possession? Is it sex work? And the person will then be connected to a caseworker and then be enveloped into a program. Part of the tension points, because this has been really popular in harm reduction spaces, is the idea that law enforcement should be that first point of contact into getting people into care, and that diversion always happens within the criminal legal system. And, you know, folks have gone back and forth about LEAD. You know, DPA has, you know, supported LEAD in places, even if individuals in DPA didn't support LEAD or were critical of LEAD. I think it was a moment in time where we were like, cool, we can get law enforcement to stop arresting people by getting them to do something else and connecting our people to services. And, you know, it was a stopgap measure. And, you know, people had a really hard time with it because some people, like myself, were like, police, this is an inappropriate use of law enforcement. And other people were like, but it's going to get us further, right? And so I think it's a tension point where people are having conversations about what kind of concessions do we make, and when is it okay for us to say that while we see the immediate good of this, this does not ultimately get us on our way. And I think there's a spectrum of people in the harm reduction community that have different ideas around it. And I think all those questions are important. But that is what LEAD is. And it's currently a tension point in our movement because everyone's like, should we or should we not work with law enforcement? And calling that question in this moment. And I think it's a discussion that is worth having within our movement. And I also believe that people believe it is like cut and dry about what the answer is. Like some people are like no, some people are like yes. And I think that currently where we are, depending on where folks are situated, sometimes the answer can be in the middle.
Yeah, just to piggyback on that really quickly. I had the opportunity to visit a LEAD program with DPA in Seattle, Washington. And I've never been one to have any kind of respect or anything for the police, but it was the police in Seattle. These few cops who took on the LEAD program in a way of wanting to understand more about harm reduction and how harm reduction works, as well as knowing that these were long-term hardened narcotics officers who felt that it would be best for them to sort of take the role of first point of contact because they understood that there was nothing gained in arresting individuals for low-level crimes involving drugs, and that was the one thing that I sort of I started to embrace when it came to LEAD. Now LEAD looks different from state to state and from city to city, and that's the problem there. and unless it can be duplicated in a way that cops and social workers literally work together, I don't see Lee really working anywhere, anywhere else. We tried to do it here in New York, and it looks like an abomination or something else. Yeah.
Okay, thank you everyone. I think for the sake of time, we're gonna wrap things up. So I'm going to pass it back to Jawanza to just, wrap things up and do a call for action.
Thank you so much, Biz. I really appreciate it. And of course, the panelists, I really don't know how to thank them enough, but I do want to make some acknowledgements before I close this out. One, there was no trans voice or trans perspective on this panel. That was not intentional. And in a deeper reflection, I know that we should have absolutely made a point to have trans perspectives, because trans people, in particular, Black trans people and brown trans people, are at unique sort of intersections of the impact of the war on drugs, capitalism, of all the ills of our society. The most vulnerable people are trans, of the trans experience, low income, HIV positive, experiencing homelessness, active and former drug users. So that is, when we have these kind of conversations, we have to bring those perspectives into the space. So I do apologize for that, and we'll do much better next time. But I think that the speakers have led me to make this call to action. As we all see, one of the reasons that we had this conversation is that the nation is calling for the defunding of the police and to reinvest in communities, the sort of paradigm shift about how we create safety, how we maintain safety, and how we make sure that safety is accessible and maintained for all communities, including communities that are active drug users, also people that sell drugs. Because the people that sell drugs oftentimes are functioning in an economy where it's almost virtually impossible to function any other way. So, but that's another conversation. And I know Cassandra cares very much about that. We also didn't hear the perspectives about how the drug war impacts parenting. And I know Cassandra also has talked a lot about this and helped me understand how the drug war has been a vehicle of child separation from families and the sort of like exploitation, degradation, and destruction of Black families in particular, and Black women especially. So clearly, the police do not create safety. In fact, they are antithetical to creating safety. So on next week, Tuesday, Vocal New York has called the movement, hopefully will follow, us to go outside of City Hall in New York City to demand that Mayor de Blasio and that Speaker Corey Johnson do not pass the city budget, which is due by June 30th, without reducing the NYPD budget by $1 billion and reinvesting those funds into the kinds of healthcare services, education, housing, drug user health services that we actually need. In fact, and our colleague again who we were mentioning, Jasmine Bonella, talks a lot about how the New York City project Healing NYC, the vast majority of the funding went to the NYPD to address drug user health and drug user issues in New York City. And I know that Cassandra, and I think Robert was there too, in 2017, we organized a protest outside of the One Police Plaza. And back then we're saying defund the police. These are not new calls. We are part of a continuum of a movement that is doing this work forever. So I'm putting into the chat a link to a registration page to get more information about that direct action. I ask that everyone here shares that. In fact, one of the reasons that we rushed to have this conversation was to make sure that a critical mass of folks had a deeper analysis, a deeper understanding about the relationships between state violence, the police, and the vehicle of the drug war as a political apparatus of political suppression. In fact, the drug war was launched to crush the anti-war left during the Nixon administration, and also to crush the Black radical movements that were taking place in this country, like all the heroes we all have in our minds. Like the drug war was created to address them. And it's still functioning in that way. And most people don't understand that because they're, of all the reasons. So with that, I want to close this out by giving each panelist one more second to say anything that they want to say that wasn't said today. And I wish all of you, great power and strength. And I know that it is important that we keep our people alive, which is why I believe in reformation and working in an organization like Vocal, because we cannot build the kind of movement that will build the kind of power that we need to dismantle the drug war, to challenge the capital S state. That's what we're in that's the work that we're doing. And the work is having these conversations. A lot of times I heard people say, well, I'm not really sure what to do about that. But figuring that out starts right here. And it starts when we expand our framework of consideration beyond reformation and towards abolition. And that's why I'm so thankful that every person that's on this call got on today, that you spread that word, that you share these stories and these perspectives, and that you consider them. So again, I want to just go from Kenyon to Robert to Cassandra, and then we'll close out. Thank you all so much on behalf of Vocal New York and our Drug Users Union.
Just closing remarks. I just, not much more to say, just, you know, check out, we at thebody.com cover a lot of, you know, issues related to not just HIV, but a lot about criminalization, both in terms of drug use, sex work, and the criminalization of HIV status. So just check us out there. Thank you.
Really quickly, thank you, Jawanza, once again. And once again, I am honored to have the opportunity to sit with Cassandra and with Kenyon on this panel. You guys were rocking, and I'm just blessed to be a part of it. Drug users across the United States, from my understanding, have had enough. We're no longer waiting for other individuals to invite us to their tables. We're setting our own table, and we're inviting individuals to that table. For the longest, we have now gone through our 8th president and more than four or 5 decades of the longest running war in U.S. history. $1.5 trillion spent on the systematic extermination of a people. This time right here, this place right here, where we are, is an opportunity for us to move and get concrete change. And the one way in which we do that is by coming together. Always remembering that we have our own work to do, but working toward also not ending silo work, but just, but for a moment, putting it on pause so that we move forward with what's needed in this country. And that's to make sure that people understand that this thing that has happened is because of the drug war. And we need to end it. And it needs to end now.
I just want to thank everyone so much for this time. Vocal, thank you so much for having me. Kenyon and Robert, thank you so much for being in conversation. I would just say our movement needs political education. And I'm not going to tell you to read books. I'm just going to tell you to find people to follow and read and talk to people and challenge and interrogate. There is no golden egg in our movement. We need to interrogate it all, except the humanity of each other. And so how do we move forward and recognize that we're already building the alternative? And we have to make sure that we build it build it like we want it, not the way that they say it has to be.
Wow, thank you so much, Cassandra. Just 2 more things before y'all go. Robert, I was wondering if you have a Cash App or Venmo or any of those quick money transfer apps. Can you?
Yes, I do.
I'll put it in the chat.
Say again?
If you have like Cash App or Venmo or anything like that I can share. So while Robert does that, I hope that folks will consider sharing some resources with Robert, because Robert does a lot of work, does a lot of traveling. And like not everybody like myself or like Cassandra or like Kenyon are working in this work. Like this is my day job, even though it's also my calling, this is my day job, so I'm getting paid. But I do think that these kinds of conversations, we cannot, I have a really strong politic about this. We cannot fund a movement by paying leaders to speak their truth. But we must take care of people whenever this is much more than speaking at a rally. This is having a conversation. This is a training to how to understand the world. So it's important that we share these things. So I'm gonna put into the chat Robert's Cash App. Robert, I just wanna confirm that this is right. It says Robert Swar. I'll definitely send something. Oh, no, that's right. Okay. You're sending that privately, Robert, just so you
Yeah.
know.
Yeah, okay. So,
So, the last thing I'll
my
say.
bad.
Go ahead, Robert. The last thing I'll say is, well, we have only scratched the surface of what this really means. Like our vision for this conversation is much more. I mean, we couldn't, every point that each panelist brought up, every question that each attendee brought up, like we could have had a whole conversation about that alone by itself. So this is an ongoing work, and I wanted to add to Cassandra's point, our movements need political education. That's why this video is going to be uploaded to YouTube, and I will be sending that out. If you get the weekly, the guide to your week vocal email every Sunday, then a link to this video will be there, so you can share it with your friends and family, because you need people to understand, to start these conversations. And finally, we are the ones that we have been waiting for. We are the only ones that are coming to save us. And it is up to all of us to ensure that we are building out the kinds of movements that are incredibly inclusive, that center the most vulnerable, and that are oriented towards building a world of egalitarianism, of self-determination, which means liberation for all people. So go with that and go into the world and demand what you deserve.